witches or Valhalla.
They came not as whispers, but as storms. Imagine a quiet island monastery, monks bent over sacred manuscripts, their world filled with prayer and silence. When suddenly, the horizon darkens. Dragon-proud ships slice through the waves, carrying men whose names would become terror itself, the Vikings. For centuries, we've been told a simple story that Vikings descended on Ireland to slaughter monks and burn their holy places. But what if that isn't the full truth? What if, hidden beneath the blood and ashes, there was something far more complicated? Something that would reshape Christianity itself? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see how the Vikings didn't just treat Irish monks as victims, they also transformed them into unexpected allies. And the payoff? It might just change the way you think about the so-called barbarians of the North. Before we can understand the Vikings, we must understand the world they sailed into. Ireland in the early Middle Ages wasn't filled with castles or great cities. Its treasures were locked away in monasteries. These were not just places of prayer. They were vaults of gold, jeweled chalices, sacred relics, and manuscripts illuminated with painstaking care. In a land without banks or fortresses, monasteries were both spiritual sanctuaries and economic powerhouses. But power attracts predators. To a Viking warband hungry for silver and slaves, a monastery was the perfect storm, isolated, undefended, and overflowing with wealth. And so, when the longships first touched Irish shores, it wasn't towns they sought. It was the holy men of God. But how far were they willing to go? Were these raids simple thefts or deliberate acts of sacrilege meant to break the soul of Ireland? Keep watching, because what happens next will blur the line between brutality and strategy. The first Viking raid on Ireland is etched into memory in the year 795. Their target? The lonely monastery on Rathlin Island, a place where monks believed the sea itself was a barrier against evil. But evil came on longships. The quiet rhythm of monastic prayer gave way to the clash of axes against doors, to the sickening thud of steel against flesh. Those who weren't cut down were dragged screaming into the holds of ships. What began as an isolated strike soon grew into a pattern. No monastery was safe. The sacred island of Iona, already famous for its holy manuscripts, was attacked again and again. The annals record one massacre in chilling simplicity: 68 monks murdered in cold blood. Picture the scene. The air once filled with Gregorian chants now pierced by screams, manuscripts burning as flames licked the rafters, the salty wind carrying the scent of ink, parchment, and death. The Vikings did not respect sanctity. To them, a chalice was no holy vessel, only melted silver. A cross was not sacred, it was loot. And yet, these were not mindless rampages. The Vikings learned quickly. They realized that coastal monasteries were perfect prey, rich, undefended, and close to the sea. They could strike with precision, kill or enslave, and then vanish back into the horizon before any Irish defense could assemble. It was lightning war centuries before the word existed. At this stage, the monks were nothing but victims, slaughtered on altars, chained as slaves, or left wandering in despair. But even in this storm of blood, something darker was stirring. Because soon the Vikings would move beyond raiding. They would not only take lives and treasures, they would take roots. And that twist would forever change the story of monks and their supposed tormentors. The monks of Ireland knew suffering. For them, martyrdom wasn't just an abstract idea, it became a grim reality. When Vikings stormed Iona in 806, the massacre of nearly 70 monks was remembered not as senseless violence, but as red martyrdom, death for Christ's sake. Survivors who escaped told tales of comrades butchered on altars, their blood mingling with sacred wine. But the Vikings weren't merely butchers, they were slavers. Captured monks were dragged in chains onto longships, their chants replaced by the clink of iron shackles. They were sold in bustling slave markets across the Norse world, from Dublin to Iceland, even as far as Constantinople. To the Vikings, a holy man was worth as much as gold, sometimes more. The monks' blood sanctified the land, but their bodies lined Viking coffers. Yet here's where the story shifts. The Vikings were not content with mere plunder. Over time, they sought something more valuable than treasure. If you think every Irish monastery went up in flames, you'd be wrong. The image of Vikings torching every holy site is powerful, but it's only half the truth. Yes, many monasteries were reduced to charred ruins, their libraries lost forever. But others survived. Some were spared not by divine protection, but by Viking calculation. The Norse were raiders, but they weren't reckless. They chose their targets carefully. The biggest and richest monasteries, those along coasts and rivers, were irresistible. A single raid could yield chalices of gold, silver reliquaries, and even high-ranking captives worth ransoms. Smaller or inland sites, however, were often overlooked. Too far, too poor, too troublesome. To the Vikings, efficiency mattered more than piety, and monasteries weren't always defenseless. Some built stone walls, rallied militias, or even hired warriors for protection. Others took a different approach: diplomacy. They offered tribute, food, or access to markets. In some cases, monks struck deals with the very raiders who had slaughtered their brethren only months before. Survival demanded compromise. It was a cruel lottery. One monastery could wake to find its towers burning, while another, just miles away, welcomed Vikings as trading partners. The same hands that once wielded axes could, on another day, shake hands in agreement. This forces a haunting question. If the men who butchered your brothers returned not with blades but with bargains, would you refuse them? Could you refuse them? For the monks of Ireland, the answer would not just decide their fate. It would reshape their entire relationship with the Northmen. And what unfolded next would be stranger than anyone could have imagined. As the raids intensified, monks fled. Manuscripts, the lifeblood of their culture, were hidden or smuggled inland. Some monasteries built fortifications, transforming holy places into fortresses. Others relocated altogether, abandoning sacred ground that had been sanctified for centuries. But not all monks resisted. Some adapted. Some sought protection under local kings, who themselves sometimes allied with Viking forces. Irish politics was already cutthroat. Chieftains fought chieftains, and suddenly the Vikings became a weapon in these bloody rivalries. It was no longer simply Viking against monk. It was monk against monk, Irish lord against Irish lord, with the Vikings as mercenaries for hire. And here lies the irony. The destroyers of monasteries would soon kneel in those very same sanctuaries. But before we get to that, I need to pause and ask you something. If you're gripped by this dark story of betrayal, survival, and transformation, make sure you hit the like button. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive into history's shadows. Because what's about to unfold isn't just about blood. It's about conversion, alliance, and the birth of something new. By the mid-9th century, something extraordinary unfolded. The very men once described in the Irish annals as heathen devils began crossing themselves at altars. Vikings, who had spilled monkish blood and plundered relics, started converting to Christianity. At first, it was practical. A Viking warlord seeking marriage into an Irish royal family could hardly remain a pagan. Baptism offered legitimacy, alliances, and access to trade networks. Conversion was as much politics as piety. But something deeper began to take root. Viking leaders accepted baptism, and their children were raised in the same faith the monks had fought to preserve. Suddenly, monasteries that had once been sacked were being rebuilt with Viking silver. Holy relics lost in raids were returned as gifts of reconciliation. Imagine the sight. A monk who had once hidden sacred manuscripts from fire now standing at a font, pouring water over the head of a Viking child. For monks, the experience was bewildering. These were the same men who had chained their brothers, who had laughed as libraries burned. Now they knelt in prayer beside them. Enemy and ally became indistinguishable. Pagan warlords commissioned crosses, and churches rose from the ashes of old ruins. But here is the unsettling question. Were these conversions genuine acts of faith, or just another mask worn by pragmatic raiders? Was the cross a true symbol of salvation, or merely a tool in the Viking arsenal of survival? The truth lies in their legacy, and what that legacy reveals is both shocking and ironic. The story deepens in ways no monk could have foreseen. Vikings didn't simply kneel at altars. They marched into Irish politics. Kings and even clerics, desperate to tip the balance in endless rivalries, began hiring Viking warbands as mercenaries. Imagine monks who had once cursed these raiders, now watching them fight in the service of their own patrons, axes flashing not against cloisters, but against rival Irish lords. And from this uneasy partnership, something remarkable emerged: intermarriage. Viking warriors took Irish wives, and their children became a new people, the Norse Gaels. They spoke both tongues, prayed to both gods at first, and blended the cultural DNA of raiders and monks. Neither wholly Norse nor wholly Irish, they forged a hybrid identity that would reshape Ireland's future. Nowhere was this more visible than in Dublin. Once a brutal slave market, it transformed into a thriving urban hub under Viking rule. Here, trade flourished, silver flowed, and coins were struck that carried both pagan runes and Christian crosses, a living paradox stamped in metal. The very men who once spat on holy relics now bore the cross into battle, turning symbols of faith into weapons of war. But do not be deceived. This was no smooth union. Trust was a brittle currency. Beneath every handshake lurked suspicion. Beneath every alliance, the possibility of betrayal. And betrayals, when they came, cut deeper than any axe. The question was no longer if blood would spill again, but when and whose. What did this Viking storm leave behind? For some monasteries, nothing but ruins and ashes. Priceless manuscripts were lost forever. Sacred relics vanished into the Viking diaspora, scattered across Europe. But paradoxically, the Viking Age also sparked renewal. Some monasteries rebuilt stronger with fortified walls. Others embraced new influences, their art and scripture reflecting Norse patterns. Even the trauma itself became part of Ireland's spiritual identity. The memory of martyrs, the endurance of faith under siege. It was as if the monks had been reforged in fire. But the scars ran deep, and historians would later wonder, were the Vikings truly destroyers or unwilling partners in a grander transformation? For centuries, monks told the story their way. Vikings were demons, monsters, instruments of Satan. And who can blame them? The blood of their brothers had stained the altars. But modern historians tell a different tale. Yes, there was bloodshed, but there was also trade, settlement, even cultural exchange. Without Vikings, Ireland's cities might never have emerged. Without their networks, Christianity might not have spread so widely. The truth lies somewhere between horror and partnership. And that tension, that duality, is why this story still grips us today. But one final question remains. What do we make of the monks themselves? Were they martyrs, victims, or survivors who adapted to the storm? The story of how Vikings treated Irish monks isn't a tale of good versus evil. It's a story of survival. Yes, the monks bled. Yes, they died. But they also endured. And in enduring, they transformed their enemies into allies, and their tormentors into fellow Christians. The Vikings came to Ireland as destroyers. They left as neighbors. And the monks, once prey, became the unlikely gatekeepers of a shared future. If you found this story gripping, then you'll want to keep watching, because history is filled with tales just as dark, just as shocking, and just as transformative. So before you go, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell. And don't stop here. Click on the next video on your screen, where we'll uncover another scandalous chapter of history, because the past never sleeps, and neither should our curiosity.